The chains on her wrists were made of silver, and silver was the one thing that could make a wolf feel like nothing at all. Lyra knelt in the snow with her head down and her knees soaked through. And she did not fight the men who held her arms because fighting had stopped meaning anything 3 days ago. Around her, in a wide circle, stood every member of the Ashgrave pack who could walk. They had come to watch her die. Nobody spoke. The only sound was wind moving through the black trees at the edge of the execution grounds, and somewhere far off, a raven calling out twice before it went quiet. She was called a mate killer. That was the charge, the whole charge, spoken once by the pack elders and never questioned again. Corin was dead. Lyra was the one who carried him out of the fire. The elders looked at her blackened hands and decided that was proof enough. Nobody asked why his wounds did not look like fire. Nobody asked why she had screamed his name until her throat tore. They only saw smoke on her skin and grief that looked, to frighten people, exactly like guilt. Lyra had stopped trying to explain 3 nights ago. Explaining took energy, and she did not have any left. She had given it all to the fire, to the screaming, to dragging the body that would not answer her out of a burning house that used to be a home. Footsteps came across the frozen ground, slow and even, the kind of footsteps that did not need to hurry because everyone else would wait for them. The crowd did not part so much as flatten, every head bowing at once, like grass under sudden wind. Alpha King Draven Ashgrave walked into the circle the way weather moves in before a storm. No warning, just pressure, dropping. He was tall in the way that made rooms feel smaller, and quiet in the way that made silence feel dangerous. His coat was black, unmarked, no crown, no ceremony, because for a king like Draven, ceremony was something other people needed and he did not. His eyes found her before his feet stopped moving, and for one strange second, Lyra thought she saw something flicker there that did not belong on the face of a man about to end her life. Then it was gone, and he held out his hand, and one of the guards placed the ceremonial blade into it. The metal caught the gray morning light and turned it silver white, sharp enough to end an argument the pack had already finished having. Lyra Ashwood, Draven said. His voice was flat, official, built for exactly this kind of moment. You stand condemned for the killing of your fated mate, Corin Vale. The law of this pack allows no mercy for that crime. Lyra lifted her chin. If she was going to die, she decided somewhere around midnight the night before. She would not do it looking at the ground. I didn't kill him, she said. Her voice came out rough, but it did not shake. That claim was already heard, Draven said, and already judged. By people who didn't ask a single real question. A ripple moved through the crowd, a collective breath sucked in at once, because nobody spoke to the Alpha King like that. Not even the ones about to die by his hand. Draven's jaw tightened. He raised the blade. 200 wolves held their breath. He brought it down. It never landed. His arm stopped in the air, frozen the way a man freezes when his own body betrays him without asking permission first. A sound left him, low and involuntary, somewhere between a growl and a gasp, and his other hand shot to his own chest, gripping the fabric of his coat as though something underneath it had caught fire. Lyra felt it too, in the same instant, a burn blooming under her collarbone so sudden and so sharp that she cried out before she understood why. Her collar, torn loose during the walk to the grounds, had slipped down just enough to show a mark she had carried since birth and never once explained to anyone, because nobody had ever asked, and she had never had a reason to think it mattered. A birthmark, rust-colored, shaped like a crescent moon with a small break in the curve, sitting just above her heart. Draven stared at it, as if the snow itself had spoken his name. The blade slipped from his hand and landed point down in the frozen ground, forgotten. He did not reach for it again. 200 wolves who had come to watch an execution instead watched their king drop to one knee in the snow, in front of a woman still condemned to die, and press his hand flat against his own ribs, like he was holding something inside himself together. Clear the grounds, he said. His voice had changed. It no longer sounded like a verdict. It sounded, for the first time Lyra had ever heard from him, like a man who did not know what he was looking at. Nobody moved at first. Guards glanced at each other, unsure whether an order interrupted by a king falling to his knees was still an order at all. Now, Draven said, and this time it cracked through the crowd like a whip, and 200 wolves scattered without another word, leaving only Lyra, still chained, still kneeling, and the king who had almost killed her, still on one knee across from her in the snow. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind picked up again, pulling at her hair, at his coat, and somewhere behind them the raven called out a third time and then did not call again. What is that? Draven said finally, nodding toward her collarbone without quite looking directly at it, as if looking too closely might make it disappear, or make it more real. He did not seem to know which he was more afraid of. A birthmark, Lyra said. I've had it since I was born. Since you were born, he repeated, quiet, almost to himself. Why does that matter to you? She asked. You were about to kill me a minute ago. Draven did not answer that. Instead he reached out, slow, the way a man reaches toward something he is not sure will bite him, and pulled the collar of his own coat aside at the chest. There, beneath his ribs, in skin that had clearly known its share of old wounds, was a mark that matched hers exactly. Same crescent shape, same small break in the curve, same rust color, like something old and half-forgotten, waiting. Lyra's breath caught somewhere in her throat and stayed there. That's not possible, she said. No, Draven agreed. It shouldn't be. He rose to his feet slowly, and for the first time since she had been dragged out to this frozen field, he looked at her the way a person looks at someone, rather than something. Not a criminal, not a case already judged. A person, kneeling in the snow, cold and bound and staring back at him with the same confusion written across her face that he was almost certainly wearing on his own. Bring her inside, he said to the two guards who had not run far enough to be out of earshot. Unchain her. Bring her to the war room. My king, one of the guards said carefully. The sentence is delayed, Draven said, in a tone that did not invite a second sentence to follow the first. Indefinitely. The guards exchanged one more look, the kind that passed for an entire conversation between men who had served together long enough to read each other without words, and then they moved to obey, unlocking the silver chains from around Lyra's wrists. The moment the metal came off her skin, her wolf surged back into her blood all at once, a rush of warmth after days of cold suppression, and she nearly fell forward with the force of it. A hand caught her elbow before she hit the ground. Draven's hand. He did not linger there. He let go the instant she had her footing again, as though touching her longer than necessary was a risk he was not ready to take, and stepped back, putting the careful, formal distance of a king between them once more. Walk, he said. You'll want the fire in the castle more than you want to stand out here explaining yourself to a field of snow. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, snow melting cold against her knees, her wrists raw and free, her collarbone still faintly burning, where the mark had flared to life against every plan the pack had made for her that morning. You still think I killed him, she said. It was not a question. Draven's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way water goes still, right before it freezes over completely. I think, he said slowly, that today just became a great deal more complicated than a killing. He turned and started walking toward the castle without waiting to see if she followed, the same way he had walked into the circle earlier, certain that the world would simply arrange itself around whatever he decided to do next. Lyra stood alone in the trampled snow for one more moment, looking down at the blade still standing upright where he had dropped it, its edge no longer meant for her throat, its purpose suddenly as uncertain as everything else about this morning. Then she followed him, because there was nothing else in the world left for her to do, and because some small, stubborn part of her, the part that had survived 3 days of chains and grief and a fire that still lived behind her eyes every time she closed them, wanted very badly to know why a king who had raised a blade to end her life was now walking ahead of her like she was something worth protecting. The castle rose out of the tree line the way it always had, gray stone against gray sky, its towers cutting sharp lines into clouds that had not broken since the morning Corin died. Lyra had seen it 100 times from a distance, had lived her whole life in its shadow, but she had never once imagined she would walk through its gates as anything other than a prisoner being marched to her death. Now she walked through them as something else entirely, something neither of them had a word for yet. Guards at the entrance straightened when they saw the king approaching, and then went very still and very quiet when they saw who walked several paces behind him, wrists bare, collar still loose, no chains, no escort holding her arms. Word of what had happened on the execution grounds had clearly not yet reached the castle gates, and the guards' confusion showed plainly on their faces before training smoothed it back into blank obedience. Draven did not explain anything to them. He never did. He simply walked past, and Lyra followed, and the guards let them both through without a word, because questioning the Alpha King was not something anyone in that castle had ever survived doing twice. Inside, the air changed. It was warmer, heavier, thick with the smell of old wood smoke and older stone, and Lyra felt her body respond to it in a way she did not expect, a loosening in her chest that had nothing to do with temperature. She had spent 3 days in a cold cell waiting to die. The warmth almost hurt. They walked in silence through corridors lined with portraits of Ashgrave kings long dead, their painted eyes following her the way real eyes might have, judging, wondering, waiting to see what she would do with a second chance nobody had planned to give her. Draven did not look at any of them. He walked like a man who had looked at those same painted faces every day of his life, and had long since stopped seeing them as anything more than wallpaper. Finally, he stopped outside a heavy door at the end of a corridor lit by torchlight instead of the cold winter sun, and pushed it open without knocking, because there was no one left in this castle who outranked him enough to need announcing. The war room was smaller than Lyra expected. A round table at its center covered in old maps and older scars from decades of knives being driven into wood during arguments that mattered more than the furniture. A fire burned low in a stone hearth along one wall, and Draven crossed to it immediately, throwing another log on without ceremony, without looking back to see if she had followed him inside. She had. She stood just past the doorway, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether this was a room she was allowed to be in at all, unsure of almost everything, except the strange, steady burn still living beneath her collarbone. "Sit," Draven said, without turning around. She sat, because her legs were tired in a way that had nothing to do with walking, and because some instinct she did not fully trust told her that arguing with him right now would accomplish nothing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire cracked and spat sparks up the chimney. Somewhere outside, wind pushed against old stone walls that had clearly weathered worse. "You want to know what that mark means?" Draven said finally, still facing the fire. "I want to know why you almost killed me and then didn't," Lyra said. "The mark seems like a smaller question." That earned her something close to a huff, not quite a laugh, but close enough to be its cousin. He turned then, finally, and looked at her directly, the firelight throwing half his face into shadow and leaving the other half sharp and unreadable. "It isn't smaller," he said. "It's the whole answer." He crossed the room, pulled a heavy leather-bound book down from a high shelf that looked untouched by anyone in years, and set it open on the table between them. Pages yellowed with age, ink faded in places to little more than ghost marks on the paper. He turned it to face her and pointed to a symbol drawn in careful, old-fashioned script, a crescent moon, with a small break in the curve. Lyra's stomach dropped. "What is it?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer was going to change everything about the life she had lived before this morning. "A warden mark," Draven said. "Older than the execution law that almost killed you today. Older than most of what this pack calls tradition. It doesn't appear often. Some kings live their whole reign and never see one. And when it does appear..." Draven closed the book slowly, as if closing it too fast might undo whatever had already been set in motion the moment her collar slipped in the snow. "It means we're bound," he said. "Not by choice, not by ceremony. By blood, going back generations, further than either of us can trace on our own. It isn't something either of us agreed to, it's something we were born carrying, whether we wanted it or not." Lyra sat very still, the fire warm against her face, the mark beneath her collarbone still faintly aching, like a bruise that had only just begun to heal. "So that's why you stopped," she said quietly. "Not because you believed me, because of a mark on my skin." Draven did not answer right away, and in the silence that followed, Lyra understood something that made the warmth of the fire feel suddenly very far away. He had stopped because of the mark, not because he had looked at her, really looked, and seen someone who did not deserve to die kneeling in the snow. The mark had stopped his hand. She was still, in every way that mattered to him, a woman condemned. "I need to understand what happened to Corin," Draven said finally, avoiding the question entirely in the way powerful men often did when the honest answer cost them something. "Properly. Not the version the elders decided on before anyone asked you a single question." "Does that mean you believe me now?" Lyra asked. "It means," Draven said, choosing each word like a man crossing a frozen lake unsure which parts of the ice would hold his weight, "that I can no longer afford not to ask." It was not the answer she wanted. It was, she suspected, the only honest one he had to give her. And for reasons she did not fully understand yet, that honesty, however incomplete, felt like the first solid ground she had stood on in 3 days. Outside the war room windows, the gray sky finally broke, and thin winter light spilled across the old maps on the table, across the closed book with its faded crescent symbol, across the space between a king who had almost killed her and a woman who had just been given a reason, however uncertain, to keep breathing. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. There was too much to say, and neither of them yet had the words for it, so instead they simply sat, the fire between them, the mark between them, and the whole unfinished shape of whatever came next, stretching out ahead of them like a road neither had chosen to walk, but both now found themselves standing on regardless. Lyra looked down at her own hands, still faintly marked with old soot she had not quite managed to scrub away, and thought of Corin's face in the last moment she had seen it clearly, before the smoke took the rest of the memory from her. She thought of the wounds on his body that had never matched a house fire. She thought of the silence that had followed every question she tried to ask in the 3 days since, and how that silence had almost cost her everything. For the first time since the fire, someone in this castle was finally willing to ask questions instead of accepting answers that had never made sense in the first place. It was not comfort, it was not safety, but it was something. And after 3 days of having nothing, something felt very close to everything. The fire popped again, sending one last spray of sparks up into the dark chimney, and outside, the raven called out one final time before falling silent for good, as if even the birds understood that whatever this castle had been before this morning, it would not be the same again. Sleep did not come easily that night, not for Lyra, and from the sound of pacing footsteps she caught through the stone walls 2 floors above her new quarters, not for Draven either. She had been given a room in the east wing, far larger than anything she had ever lived in, with a bed piled high in furs and a window that looked out over the training yards below. It was not a cell, she understood that much, but it was not freedom either, not with 2 guards posted outside her door and a lock on the outside that she had already tested twice, quietly, just to know for certain it was there. She sat by the window instead of sleeping, watching frost creep slowly up the glass, and let her mind return, against her own wishes, to the last night she had spent with Corin. He had been laughing about something small and forgettable, some joke about the way she always burned the first batch of bread and pretended she had meant to. She could not remember the words of the joke now, only the sound of his laugh, low and easy, filling the little house they shared at the edge of the packlands. She remembered handing him a cup of tea, remembered his hand brushing hers as he took it, remembered thinking, in the ordinary, unremarkable way people think things they assume they will have forever, that she was happy. Then the smoke. It had come fast, faster than any fire she had ever heard of, filling the house before she had time to understand what was happening. She remembered screaming his name. She remembered crawling on hands and knees through air that felt like breathing coals. She remembered finding him near the back door, already down, already still, and the wounds on his chest that her fire-blurred mind had not let her look at closely enough at the time to understand. Claw marks. She knew that now, turning it over slowly in the quiet of her new room, far from the elders who had never let her finish a single sentence about what she saw, not the ragged burns a house fire left behind. 4 clean lines, deep and deliberate, the kind only a wolf's claws could make. She had tried to say this. She remembered trying, remembered the elders' faces closing like doors while she spoke, remembered being pulled away before she could describe the wounds in any real detail, remembered someone saying she was in shock, that grief did strange things to memory, that the fire had clearly done this and she was imagining monsters where there had only been an accident. Nobody had asked why a house fire would leave 4 straight lines instead of scattered burns. Nobody had asked why the smoke had filled the house so fast that even a trained wolf's senses had no warning. Nobody had asked anything at all, because it was so much easier to look at a grieving woman with soot on her hands and decide, quickly, that the story was already finished. A knock came at her door, soft, almost apologetic, nothing like the heavy fists of guards who expected obedience. Lyra did not answer at first, and the knock came again. "It's not locked from your side," Draven's voice said through the wood. "I wanted you to know that, at least." She crossed the room and opened the door herself, finding him standing there without his coat, without the formal bearing he had worn all day, looking, for just a moment, like a man who had also not slept. "You couldn't sleep either," she said. "I don't sleep well most nights," Draven admitted. "Tonight is not an improvement." He did not ask to come in, and she did not invite him, but neither of them closed the door either, and they stood there in the gap between the hallway torches and the dim firelight of her room, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that neither had to explain the closeness to anyone who might be watching. "I want to tell you something about the wounds," Lyra said, before she could talk herself out of it. "Something nobody let me finish saying 3 days ago." Draven's expression sharpened, the exhaustion in his face pushed aside by something more alert, more careful. "Tell me now." So she did. She told him about the claw marks, 4 straight lines instead of ragged burns, and the way the smoke had filled the house too fast for any natural fire she had ever heard of, and the way nobody at her trial had wanted to hear any of it, because the story they already believed was so much simpler than the one she was trying to tell. Draven listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly with every new detail, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring past her into the dim room, as though replaying the entire scene behind his own eyes. 4 lines, he said finally, evenly spaced. Yes. Show me where. Lyra touched her own chest, tracing 4 lines across it the way she remembered them on Corin's body. High on the left side, deep enough to have been fatal on their own, fire or no fire. Draven's face went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to finish. That's not an accidental wound pattern, he said quietly. That's a killing strike. Deliberate. Controlled. I know, Lyra said. I've known since the night it happened. Nobody wanted to hear it. I want to hear it, Draven said, and something in the way he said it, low and certain, made her believe him for the first time since the execution grounds. Every detail you remember, starting from the moment you first smelled smoke, I want all of it, tonight, while it's still clear in your mind, and before anyone else has the chance to convince you to doubt yourself. They sat together at the small table near her window, and for the first time in 3 days, someone let Lyra speak an entire memory, from beginning to end, without interrupting, without deciding halfway through that she was wrong, without treating her grief as a confession. She told him about the strange speed of the smoke, thick and choking within moments of the first smell reaching her. She told him about the sound she had heard just before, a low growl that she had dismissed at the time as her own panicked imagination, but that she now suspected, telling it aloud for the first time, had been real. A growl, Draven repeated, not Corin's. No, Lyra said. Corin's voice was different. This was lower, older, somehow. I only heard it for a second before the smoke came. Draven leaned back slowly, one hand rubbing across his jaw, thinking through something he clearly did not want to say out loud yet. There are only a handful of wolves in this pack strong enough to move that fast and leave wounds that clean, he said finally. Fewer still, with reason to want your mate dead, and no reason at all to want anyone looking closely at how he died. Do you have a name in mind? Lyra asked. I have several, Draven said. None I'm ready to say aloud yet, not until I have more than a suspicion built from a memory you were never allowed to finish telling. He rose from the table then, and for a moment, Lyra thought he meant to leave without another word. The way he so often seemed to move through the world, decisions made and executed before anyone else caught up to them. Instead he paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite name. I owe you an apology, he said, not for the mark stopping my hand, for not stopping it myself, before the mark ever had the chance to. Lyra did not answer right away. 3 days of grief and silence had taught her caution, and an apology from the man who had raised a blade to her throat that same morning was not something she knew how to accept easily. You raised that blade because everyone told you a story that was easy to believe, she said finally. I don't need an apology for that. I need you to keep asking questions until the true story is the one this whole pack believes instead. That's the only apology that matters now. Draven held her gaze for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that looked almost like respect, an emotion she had not expected to see directed at her from a king who, hours earlier, had been fully prepared to end her life without a second thought. Then that's what I'll do, he said, and left her at the door of a room that was not quite a cell and not quite a home, with a promise from a man she was bound to by blood she had never asked for, and a memory of claw marks that finally, after 3 long days, someone else believed were real. She did not sleep that night either, but for the first time since the fire, the sleeplessness did not feel entirely like grief. Somewhere underneath it, quiet and unfamiliar, was something that felt almost like hope, fragile and unproven, but present all the same, the way the first thin light of morning is present long before the sun itself ever clears the trees. The following morning, Draven summoned his most trusted investigator, a sharp-eyed older wolf named Edric who had served 3 Ashgrave kings before him, and had learned, across all 3 reigns, exactly which questions were safe to ask aloud, and which were better kept behind a closed door. Draven closed the door. I want the fire investigated again, Draven said, quietly. No mention of Lyra, no mention of the execution, no mention of anything that would tell whoever did this that we're looking a second time. Edric's eyebrows rose slightly, the only visible sign of surprise he allowed himself after decades of practice keeping his face still. The elders closed that case 3 days ago, my king. The elders were wrong, Draven said, and I intend to prove it before this pack executes an innocent woman for a crime someone else committed and walked away from clean. Edric studied him for a long moment, the way a man studies a puzzle he suspects has more pieces than anyone has bothered to look for yet. You believe her. I believe the wounds on Corin Vale's body were never consistent with an accidental fire, Draven said. Whether or not I believe her is a separate question, and one I intend to answer properly, not on instinct. It was not quite the endorsement Edric was clearly hoping to hear, but it was enough to send him out the door with quiet instructions and the particular focus of a man who took his work seriously, precisely because so few people ever noticed him doing it. Draven watched him go, then turned back to the window of the war room, looking out over the same frozen field where, one day earlier, he had nearly ended the life of the one person in this entire pack who might carry the truth he had spent 3 days failing to look for. The mark beneath his ribs ached faintly, the way it had ached since the moment it first appeared, a low and constant reminder that whatever happened next, he was no longer simply a king weighing the fate of a stranger. He was bound to her now, by blood older than his crown, in ways neither of them had chosen and neither of them yet fully understood. He did not know, standing at that window with frost creeping slowly across the glass, that the wolf responsible for Corin Vale's death was, at that very moment, standing in a corridor not 2 floors below him, wearing the uniform of the Royal Guard, and watching the investigation begin with the calm, practiced patience of someone who had gotten away with worse before, and fully intended to do so again. 3 days passed before Edric returned with anything worth reporting, and in those 3 days, Lyra learned the strange shape of a life that was neither prisoner nor guest. She was allowed to walk the castle grounds, but never alone. She was given meals brought to her room, though she noticed, without much surprise, that a guard always tasted the food first before setting it down in front of her, a quiet, careful courtesy that told her more about how uncertain her position still was than any words could have. She spent much of that time in the castle library, a room she had not known existed until a guard, following Draven's instructions, escorted her there on the second morning, and left her largely alone among shelves that reached higher than she could see without craning her neck. She had never had much reason to read deeply before. Her old life had been small and steady, full of ordinary things, tending a garden, mending clothes, laughing at Corin's terrible jokes. There had been no cause to study old pack law, no reason to wonder what a warden mark meant, no reason at all to think her own skin carried something the elders themselves might have forgotten existed. Now she read everything she could find on the subject, sitting cross-legged on the library floor with books stacked around her like a wall, because the mark beneath her collarbone had changed everything about the life she thought she understood, and she was not the kind of woman who liked living inside a mystery without at least trying to solve it herself. Most of what she found was frustratingly thin. The warden bond, as it was called in the oldest texts, appeared only a handful of times across centuries of pack history, always between an alpha and a wolf born far outside the expected bloodlines of royal succession. The text described the bond as older than the crown itself, a pairing meant to balance power that had grown too concentrated, too dangerous, in a single bloodline. One particularly old passage, its ink so faded she had to hold it close to a candle to read it clearly, suggested the bond activated only in moments of extreme injustice, as though the old magic behind it existed specifically to correct wrongs that ordinary law had failed to catch. She sat with that thought for a long while, turning it over slowly. If the bond had appeared to stop an unjust execution, then somewhere in its old, half-forgotten purpose was an answer she had been circling since the moment Draven's blade froze above her throat. The mark had not appeared because of who she was. It had appeared because of what was about to happen to her. That thought comforted her less than she expected it to. On the 4th morning, Draven found her still in the library, asleep in a chair with an open book resting against her chest, and for a moment he simply stood in the doorway watching her, unsure whether to wake her or let her rest a little longer. The choice was made for him when she stirred on her own, blinking awake to find him watching her with an expression that, for once, held none of the careful formality he usually wore like armor. "Edric found something," he said, once she was fully awake and had set the book aside. Lyra sat up straighter, sleep falling away fast. "Tell me." "Not here," Draven said, glancing toward the library's open doors, somewhere quieter. They walked together to the war room, and this time, Lyra noticed, the guards along the corridors no longer looked at her with the open confusion they had shown that first night. Word had clearly spread through the castle by now, whispered from guard to guard, servant to servant, about the woman condemned to die whose birthmark had stopped the king's own blade. She could feel the weight of their eyes even when they were careful not to look at her directly, curiosity and suspicion tangled together in every glance. Edric was waiting in the war room when they arrived, a small cloth bundle sitting on the table in front of him. He waited until Draven closed the door before speaking. "I went back to the site of the fire," Edric said, "and searched the ground more carefully than the elders bothered to the first time. Most of the debris had already been cleared, but I found this caught in the underbrush at the edge of the property, likely torn loose during whatever happened that night, and overlooked in the rush to close the case." He unfolded the cloth, revealing a short length of silver thread, the kind woven only into the ceremonial trim of the Royal Guard's formal uniform, a detail Lyra would never have recognized on her own, but that made Draven's face go instantly, dangerously still. "That's guard thread," he said quietly. "It is," Edric confirmed, "which means whoever was present at that fire either wore the royal uniform that night, or wanted very badly for us to believe they did." Lyra looked between the two of them, a cold feeling settling low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter chill still clinging to the stone walls. "You think one of your own men did this?" "I think," Draven said slowly, "that I need to find out exactly who was assigned to patrol duty near your home that night, and why none of them reported hearing anything unusual, when a fire that fast and that fatal should have drawn attention from half a mile away." Edric nodded, already reaching for a small ledger tucked inside his coat. "I pulled the assignment records this morning, my king. There were 4 guards on rotation that night. 3 have accounted for their movements without contradiction." "And the 4th?" Draven asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer would not be simple. "Kale," Edric said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Lyra watched Draven's face carefully, looking for whatever reaction that name was supposed to provoke. What she saw instead was something far more complicated than simple suspicion. Something closer to disbelief, tangled with a reluctance that looked, to her eyes, almost like grief. "Kale has served as my second for 6 years, Draven said quietly. "He was at my side during the border conflict 2 winters ago. I trust very few people in this castle the way I trust him." "I understand that trust makes this difficult to hear," Edric said carefully, "which is exactly why I brought the thread to you privately, before saying his name to anyone else in this castle. I am not accusing him outright. I am telling you that his account of that night does not match the other 3 guards, and that thread was found less than 30 feet from where the fire began." Draven was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the small piece of silver thread as though it might rearrange itself into a different, easier answer, if he looked at it long enough. Lyra understood, watching him, that this was a different kind of pain than the one she had carried through her own trial. Hers had been the pain of being disbelieved. His was the pain of beginning to believe something about a man he had trusted for years. A betrayal that had not yet been proven but that already, in the careful stillness of his shoulders, felt unbearably close to certain. "I need more than a thread," the Draven said finally. "Before I confront a man I've trusted for 6 years, I need something that cannot be explained away as coincidence." "Then we look further," Edric said, quietly, carefully. "If Kale is involved, he will notice the moment we move carelessly, and a man capable of what was done to Corin Vale is not a man who will simply confess if given the chance to run instead." Lyra had been silent through most of this exchange, watching the 2 men work through a puzzle that had, until 4 days ago, only ever cost her something. Now, for the first time, she felt something shift inside her chest that was not quite hope and not quite anger, but sat somewhere close to both. "I want to help," she said. "Not from a library, not from a locked room with guards outside the door. I want to be part of finding out what actually happened." Draven looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing something behind his eyes, some careful calculation between the danger of involving her further, and the plain, undeniable fact that she had more reason than anyone in this castle to see the truth uncovered. "If you're going to be part of this," he said finally, "you'll need to move through this castle as something other than a prisoner still waiting on a delayed sentence. People will not speak freely around a woman they still believe is condemned to die." "Then change what they believe," Lyra said. Draven's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its shadow. "That's easier said than done, in a pack built on old law and older suspicion." "You're the king," Lyra said. "Isn't that exactly the kind of thing kings are supposed to be able to do?" Edric, watching this exchange with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned long ago never to take sides in a conversation between his king and anyone bold enough to challenge him, allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile before quickly smoothing it away. "There is a pack gathering in 3 days, Edric offered. "The Midwinter Council, where all the ranking families come to renew their oaths. It would be difficult to explain her continued confinement there, without raising exactly the kind of questions you seem determined to avoid, my king. It might also be the perfect place to see how certain people react to an accusation they don't expect to hear." Draven considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then that's where we start. Quietly, until then. No confrontations, no accusations, nothing that gives Kale, or anyone else involved, reason to suspect we're closer to the truth than the elders ever were." The meeting ended not long after, Edric slipping out first with the silver thread carefully tucked away again, leaving Draven and Lyra alone in the war room with the fire crackling low in the hearth, and 3 days stretching out ahead of them, full of careful silence, and the particular kind of tension that comes from knowing a truth is close, but not yet close enough to hold. "Thank you," Lyra said quietly, once the door had closed behind Edric, "for believing this was worth looking into properly." "Don't thank me yet," Draven said. "We don't have the truth. We have a thread and a name and 6 years of trust I'm not ready to abandon without more than suspicion to stand on." "I know," Lyra said, "but 3 days ago, nobody in this entire pack was willing to look at all. Now 2 of you are. That matters more than you probably realize." Draven did not answer that directly, but something in the way he looked at her then, quiet and considering, told her he understood exactly what she meant, and that whatever this bond between them truly was, old magic or ancient law or something neither of them yet had the right words for, it had already started changing the shape of what justice in this pack was willing to look like, one careful, uncertain step at a time. That night, unable to sleep again, Lyra allowed her mind to travel further back than the fire, back to the beginning, back to the ordinary days before any of this had happened, because it was the only way she knew to hold on to the man she had lost without letting the horror of his death overwrite every gentler memory that had come before it. She remembered meeting Corin at the edge of the training yards, years earlier, when she was still young enough to think the world was mostly simple. He had tripped over his own feet trying to impress her with a training move he clearly had not practiced enough, and instead of being embarrassed, he had laughed at himself so easily, so completely without shame, that she had found herself laughing too, and something about that shared laughter had settled into her chest and never quite left. He was not a large man, not particularly strong compared to some of the other wolves in the pack, but he had a kindness in him that Lyra had rarely seen matched, a way of noticing small things, a way of remembering exactly how she took her tea, and exactly which flowers she liked best along the garden path, small details that most people forgot the moment they stopped being useful to remember. He had never once made her feel like being his mate was a role she had to earn. He had simply loved her, plainly and steadily, the way some people love without ever needing it to be complicated. She thought of their small house at the edge of the packlands, the one that no longer existed except as a blackened square of earth. She thought of the garden she had planted along its southern wall, the one that would not bloom again this spring because there was no longer a house standing to shelter it from the worst of the winter wind. She thought of all the mornings she had woken up beside him without once imagining that any of it could end the way it had, sudden and violent and stolen by someone whose face she had not even seen. Grief, she was learning, did not move in straight lines. It came in waves, receding just long enough to let her breathe before rushing back in stronger than before, and she had learned, in the days since the fire, to simply let it move through her rather than fight against it, because fighting only seemed to make each wave crash harder. A soft knock came at her door sometime past midnight, and she was not surprised, this time, to find Draven standing there again, restless in the same way she was restless, carrying the particular sleeplessness of a man whose entire understanding of loyalty had been shaken in the space of a single afternoon. "I keep thinking about Kale," he admitted, once she had let him in, and they had settled near the low fire together, close but careful. The way 2 people are careful around a flame, neither of them fully trusts yet not to burn. 6 years. I've fought beside him. I've trusted him with decisions that could have cost me my life if he'd made the wrong call. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones best positioned to hurt us, Lyra said quietly, not because they're always the ones who want to, because they're the ones with the access, and the trust, and the reason nobody looks at them twice. Draven glanced at her, something in his expression shifting, softening slightly at the edges. "You've thought about this a great deal." "I've had 3 days locked in a cell to think about very little else," Lyra said. "Trust me, I've considered every possible reason someone might have wanted Corin dead. He didn't have enemies, he wasn't ambitious, wasn't political, didn't involve himself in pact disputes any more than he had to, which means whoever did this wasn't after him specifically. He was in the way of something bigger." Draven was quiet for a long moment, turning that thought over carefully. "You think this was never really about Corin at all?" "I think," Lyra said slowly, working the idea out loud for the first time, "that if this was about destabilizing the pack, or destabilizing you specifically, then Corin's death only makes sense as the first move in something larger, not a personal grudge, a calculated one." Draven's jaw tightened, and Lyra watched him turn that idea over, with the particular focus of a king who had spent years learning to see threats before they fully revealed themselves. "If someone wanted to weaken the Ashgrave line," he said slowly, Removing a warden-bonded mate before the bond ever had the chance to activate would be exactly the kind of move that could do it. The bond only appears in moments of extreme injustice. If Corin had lived, the mark might never have surfaced at all. Whoever did this may not have known about the mark specifically, but they may have known enough about the old law to understand that eliminating you before any bond could form was the safer path. Lyra felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cold outside. You're saying someone tried to remove me from the equation entirely, and Corin's death was simply the fastest way to do it. I'm saying it's possible, Draven said carefully. And if it's true, then whoever ordered this, because I do not believe Kale, 6 years in my service or not, acted entirely on his own initiative in something this calculated, wanted you dead just as much as they wanted Corin dead. The only reason you're alive right now is that the mark appeared before the execution could finish what the fire started. The room went very quiet after that, the fire's low crackle the only sound between them, and Lyra felt the full weight of what he was suggesting settle over her slowly, like snow accumulating on a roof that had not been built to hold this much of it. She had spent 3 days believing she was fighting to clear her name of a crime she did not commit. Now she understood she might have been fighting, without realizing it, for her very survival against someone who had planned her death from the very beginning, and simply used the pack's own execution law to try to finish the job the fire had failed to complete. Then we don't just need to find Kale, she said finally. We need to find whoever gave him the order, before they realize their plan already failed once, and decide to try again. Draven met her eyes across the low firelight, and for a moment, something passed between them that was not quite comfort, and not quite fear, but held pieces of both, the particular understanding that grows between two people who have both discovered, in the same conversation, that they are standing closer to real danger than either of them had previously believed. I won't let that happen, Draven said, quiet but certain, the words carrying a weight that surprised her, coming from a man who, 4 days earlier, had been fully prepared to end her life himself without hesitation. You barely know me, Lyra said, not unkindly, simply stating what felt like an obvious truth. I know that you're the only person in this pack who has looked at this from every angle, instead of accepting the easiest answer, Draven said. I know that whatever this bond is, it chose you, and it chose me together, and I do not intend to let whoever started this take that away before either of us understands what it means. Lyra did not have an answer for that, not one she trusted herself to say aloud without revealing more than she was ready to admit, even to herself, about the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had begun growing quietly beneath the grief she still carried for Corin. It did not feel like betrayal exactly, this new warmth. It felt more like the first thin light breaking through storm clouds that had not yet finished raining, present and real even though the storm itself had not yet passed. They sat together in silence a while longer, the fire slowly burning down to embers, neither of them quite ready to end the conversation, and neither of them entirely sure what more there was to say. When Draven finally rose to leave, he paused once more at the door, the way he had the night before. 3 days until the Midwinter Council, he said. Stay close to the guards I've assigned you. Trust no one else in this castle until we know for certain who else might be involved. I trust you, Lyra said, and was almost surprised, hearing the words leave her own mouth, at how true they felt. Draven held her gaze a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, leaving Lyra alone with the dying fire, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that whatever conspiracy had taken Corin from her, it was far from finished, and the next 3 days would decide whether she and Draven found the truth first, or whether whoever was responsible found a way to silence them both before they ever had the chance. The castle did not feel like a home yet, but it had stopped feeling entirely like a prison, and Lyra spent the following morning testing the edges of that new, uncertain freedom carefully, the way a person tests ice on a pond before deciding whether it will hold their full weight. She walked the eastern corridor without a guard's hand on her arm for the first time. She ate breakfast in the small dining hall reserved for household staff rather than alone in her room, drawing curious glances from servants who clearly did not know what to make of a woman who had nearly been executed now sitting quietly among them, buttering bread as though the whole world had not tilted sideways beneath her feet less than a week earlier. She noticed, without meaning to, every unlocked door along the corridors she walked. She noticed which windows opened easily, and which had been painted shut by years of neglect. She noticed the schedule of the guards who rotated past her hallway, the particular 15 minutes each evening where the shift change left a gap in coverage wide enough for someone determined to slip through unnoticed. It was not romantic, this careful cataloging of exits and openings. It was survival, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 3 days of chains, and an execution that had come within a single breath of finishing what the fire started. She was in the castle kitchens on the second afternoon, quietly noting the location of every knife in the block along the far wall, when Draven found her there, watching with an expression somewhere between amusement and concern. "Planning something?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "Planning to survive," Lyra said, not looking up from the knife block, "in case this arrangement changes its mind about me again." Draven was quiet for a moment, and when she finally glanced up at him, she saw something in his face that looked almost like understanding, the particular understanding of a man who had also learned, the hard way, that safety was rarely something you were simply given and allowed to keep. "It won't change its mind," he said. "You can't promise that," Lyra said. "You couldn't stop the elders from condemning me in the first place. You only stopped the blade because of a mark neither of us asked for." "That's true," Draven admitted, and she respected him a little more for not pretending otherwise. "But I am not the same king today that I was 5 days ago, and I do not intend to let this pack's fear override its judgment a second time, not while I still hold the crown." Lyra set down the knife she had been examining and turned to face him fully. "Then help me understand what I actually am now. Not a prisoner, not quite a guest, bound to you by something neither of us chose. What does that make me, in the eyes of this pack?" Draven did not answer immediately, crossing instead to sit at the long wooden table in the center of the kitchen, motioning for her to join him. She did, curious despite herself. "By old law," he said finally, "a warden-bonded pair holds equal standing before the pack, regardless of birth or rank. In theory, that means you are no longer simply a woman the elders can condemn on a whim. You carry a claim to protection that even I cannot easily override, not without unraveling law that has existed since before this castle was built." "In theory," Lyra repeated. "In practice," Draven said. "Very few of the pack currently understand what a warden bond even is, which means very few of them understand what protection it grants you. That ignorance is dangerous. It means the elders may try to challenge the bond's legitimacy rather than accept it, especially once they realize how much power it actually grants you within this court." Lyra absorbed that slowly, feeling the shape of her new situation sharpen into something both more hopeful and more precarious than she had understood a moment before. "So I'm safer than I was on the execution grounds, but not as safe as I might have assumed." "Not yet," Draven agreed, "which is exactly why the truth about Kale, and whoever gave him his orders, matters so much. If we can prove Corin's death was murder, and not the accident the elders decided it was, your innocence becomes undeniable, mark or no mark. If we cannot, there will always be those in this court who see the bond as inconvenient magic standing between them and a sentence they still believe was justified." It was a sobering thought, and Lyra sat with it for a long moment, watching the kitchen staff move quietly around them, pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. She understood, watching them, that whatever privacy she and Draven believed they had in these stolen conversations was likely an illusion. Word traveled through a castle like this one the way water traveled through cracked stone, finding every gap, reaching every corner eventually. "I need to ask you something," Lyra said finally, lowering her voice slightly, despite knowing it likely made little difference. "If the bond hadn't appeared, if my collar hadn't slipped at exactly that moment, would you have gone through with it?" Draven's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still, the way it had in the war room on that first night. "I don't know," he said, and she appreciated, more than she expected to, that he did not simply offer her the comfortable lie of certainty. "I believed the elder's account at the time. I had no reason not to. If the mark had not appeared, I likely would have carried out the sentence, and I would have believed, in that moment, that I was carrying out justice, rather than a mistake." It was a hard thing to hear, and Lyra let it sit in the space between them for a long moment before speaking again. "Thank you for telling me the truth instead of something easier." "You deserve the truth," Draven said simply. "Especially from me, given how close I came to being the reason you never had the chance to hear anything again." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young page, breathless from running, who bowed hastily before delivering his message. "My king, there's been an incident at the northern border. A dispute with the neighboring pack over grazing rights has turned violent. Several of our own wolves are wounded." Draven was on his feet immediately. The careful, reflective man Lyra had been speaking with a moment ago, replaced instantly by the king the pack needed him to be, decisive and fast-moving. "Gather the council. I'll ride out within the hour." The page bowed again and hurried off, and Draven turned back to Lyra, something conflicted crossing his face. "I need to go." "I know," Lyra said. "Go. I'll be here when you return." He hesitated a moment longer, as though there was something else he wanted to say, some piece of the conversation still unfinished, but the urgency of the moment pulled at him too strongly, and he nodded once before striding out of the kitchen, already calling orders to the guards falling into step behind him. Lyra sat alone at the long wooden table for a while after he left, listening to the sudden flurry of activity moving through the castle, boots on stone, orders shouted across courtyards, the particular controlled chaos of a pack preparing for conflict. She thought of the training she had received as a young wolf, skills she had not used seriously in years, and felt a familiar restlessness settle into her limbs, the same restlessness that had once made her spar with Corin in their small garden until they were both breathless with laughter. She did not know, sitting there in the quiet aftermath of Draven's hurried departure, that the border dispute pulling him away from the castle had not arisen entirely on its own, and that somewhere within the walls that surrounded her, a guard named Kale was watching the king's absence unfold, with the same quiet, careful satisfaction of a man who had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of opportunity to present itself. The northern border, it would turn out later, had never truly been in danger of anything more serious than a heated argument between two grazing parties, an argument that any experienced diplomat could have resolved without a single drop of blood spilled. But by the time anyone in the castle understood that the reported violence had been deliberately exaggerated to draw the king away, Draven would already be a full day's ride from the castle walls, and Lyra would be facing a danger far closer to home than either of them had prepared for. Night fell quietly over the castle, the corridors emptier than usual with so many guards riding north alongside Draven, and Lyra found herself unable to settle into sleep despite the exhaustion sitting heavy behind her eyes. She walked the halls instead, restless, trailed at a respectful distance by the one guard who had been left behind specifically to watch over her, a quiet young wolf named Fennec who had said barely a dozen words to her since being assigned the duty. It was Fennec who first noticed the smell, faint but unmistakable to a trained nose, drifting from the direction of the eastern storerooms, smoke. Lyra's whole body went cold the instant the scent reached her, memory and present danger colliding so fast she nearly lost her footing. Fennec was already moving, calling for backup, and Lyra followed, not because anyone told her to, but because some fierce, unwilling part of her refused to simply stand still and wait for fire to take something else from her without a fight. The storeroom was already half filled with smoke by the time they reached it, flames licking up one wall where barrels of oil had clearly been deliberately set alight. Fennec shouted for water, for help, and servants began pouring out of nearby rooms, forming a hurried line to fight the blaze before it could spread further into the castle's wooden support beams. It was in the chaos of that fight, smoke stinging her eyes and throat, that Lyra caught a flash of movement at the edge of the firelight, a figure retreating quietly down a side corridor, while everyone else's attention remained fixed on the flames. She recognized the guard uniform first, then, as he turned briefly to check whether he had been noticed, the face beneath it. Kale. He saw her seeing him, and for one long, suspended moment, neither of them moved, the fire crackling and roaring behind her, smoke curling up toward the ceiling in thick gray ribbons. Then Kale's expression shifted, calculation replacing surprise, and he turned and ran. Lyra did not think. She simply moved, chasing him down the side corridor while behind her the firefight continued without her, servants and guards too consumed with saving the storeroom to notice that the woman they had been assigned to protect was now sprinting alone through darkened halls after a man she had every reason to believe was a murderer. Kale was fast, faster than she expected, cutting through corridors with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent years learning every shortcut this castle offered. Lyra followed anyway, driven by something that had stopped being caution the moment she saw his face in the firelight, and became instead a furious, single-minded need to finally have an answer. He led her out through a side door into the training yards, empty and dark under a sky heavy with clouds that blocked out most of the moon's light. He turned to face her there, breathing hard, something almost like amusement flickering across his face despite the danger of his position. "You should have stayed by the fire," Kale said. "Would have been easier for both of us." "You killed him," Lyra said, her voice shaking with an anger she had been holding back for 6 long days. "Corin, you killed him, and let me take the blame." "I did what I was told to do," Kale said, and there was no shame in his voice at all, only the flat, practical tone of a man discussing a task completed efficiently, nothing personal in it. He simply happened to be standing between me and what needed to be done. "What needed to be done?" Lyra repeated, disgust curling through every word. "You," Kale said simply. "You needed to be gone before that mark of yours ever had the chance to matter. I didn't know about the birthmark specifically." Just that a warden-bonded mate, if one ever appeared, needed removing before the bond could form. Corin dying alongside you would have been the cleaner outcome. Unfortunately, you insisted on surviving the fire, and then insisted on surviving the execution too. You're proving remarkably difficult to finish. The casual cruelty in his voice lit something furious and cold in her chest, and before she had fully decided to move, she was already lunging at him, claws extending. 6 days of grief and rage finally finding an outlet. Kale sidestepped her easily, catching her arm and using her own momentum to throw her hard against the training yard fence. She hit the wood with enough force to knock the air from her lungs, and for a moment stars scattered across her vision, but she forced herself back to her feet anyway, refusing to stay down in front of the man who had taken everything from her. "Who gave the order?" she demanded, circling him now with the wary caution of a fighter rather than the blind fury of a moment before. "You said you were told. Told by who?" Kale's smile was thin and unpleasant. "That's a name you're not going to get from me tonight." He came at her fast, faster than she had time to properly brace for, and the fight that followed was brutal and short. 6 days of imprisonment, and grief having stripped some of the edge from Lyra's usual speed. Kale landed 2 solid blows before she managed to catch his wrist and twist, using a technique Corin himself had once taught her in their small garden, years ago, laughing the whole time because neither of them had ever expected her to need it seriously. The memory of Corin's laugh gave her one final surge of strength, enough to drive Kale back and buy herself a moment's space, but before either of them could close the distance again, the training yard gate slammed open, and Fennec arrived with 3 other guards close behind him, drawn by the sound of the fight. Kale's eyes flicked toward the new arrivals, calculating odds that had suddenly shifted heavily against him, and he made his choice fast, breaking away from Lyra and sprinting for the tree line at the edge of the training grounds rather than staying to fight 4 wolves at once. "Stop him!" Lyra shouted, but the guards, still catching up to the scene, were a step too slow, and Kale vanished into the dark trees before anyone could close the gap, leaving behind only the sound of his retreating footsteps and the faint, mocking echo of his earlier words. Fennec reached her side, breathing hard, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and horror at finding her alive but clearly injured. "Are you hurt?" "I'll survive," Lyra said, though her ribs ached fiercely where she had hit the fence, and her arm throbbed where Kale's grip had left deep bruises already forming beneath her skin. He confessed. He admitted he killed Corin, and that he was following someone else's orders. Fennec's expression darkened. "We need to send word to the king immediately." "Yes," Lyra agreed, though even as she said it, a cold unease was settling into her chest that had nothing to do with her injuries. The border dispute that had pulled Draven away so suddenly, so conveniently, on the exact night Kale chose to strike, no longer felt like coincidence. Someone had wanted the king gone from the castle tonight, specifically, and that someone had very nearly succeeded in finishing what the fire 6 days earlier had failed to complete. They returned to the castle to find the storeroom fire finally under control, smoke still hanging thick in the air, but the flames themselves reduced to smoldering embers under the combined effort of every servant and guard who had rushed to fight it. Lyra allowed a healer to look over her bruised ribs and arm, while messengers were dispatched north to reach Draven with word of what had happened, and it was well past midnight before she finally sat still long enough to fully absorb everything Kale had told her in that dark training yard. He had confirmed what she and Draven had already begun to suspect. This had never been about Corin specifically. It had been about her, about the bond neither of them had asked for, about someone within this pack, someone with enough authority to give Kale orders and enough patience to wait 6 days for a second opportunity, who wanted her dead badly enough to burn down a house, orchestrate an execution, and now set fire to the very castle meant to protect her, all in pursuit of the same singular goal. She did not know who that person was yet, but she understood, sitting in the healer's quiet room with her ribs wrapped and her arm throbbing, that whoever they were still out there, still patient, still willing to wait for the next opportunity, and that the fight in the training yard tonight had not ended anything. It had only confirmed how much further this still had to go before either she or Draven could truly call themselves safe. Draven returned to the castle before dawn, having ridden through the night the moment the messenger reached him, and the first thing he did upon arriving was seek her out, finding her still awake in the healer's quiet room, her ribs bandaged and her expression exhausted but resolute. "You're hurt," he said, crossing the room fast, his usual careful composure entirely abandoned in the urgency of the moment. "I'll heal," Lyra said. "Kale won't get the chance to try again so easily. Not now that we both know for certain what he's capable of, and what he's still willing to do to finish the job." Draven sat beside her, his jaw tight with a fury she recognized easily, having felt the same fury herself only hours earlier in the dark training yard. The border dispute was fabricated. There was no real conflict. Someone wanted me away from this castle tonight. I know, Lyra said quietly. Cale as good as confirmed it himself. This was never just about Corin Draven. Someone wants me gone badly enough to burn down a house, manipulate an execution, and now set fire to your own castle. And whoever they are, they're patient enough to keep trying until they succeed. Draven's hand found hers then, careful, uncertain, the way two people reach for each other after surviving something neither of them had fully processed yet. Then we stop being patient too, he said. Whoever is behind this ends their plans tonight, in every way that matters, starting with finding out exactly who gave Cale his orders, before they have the chance to try a third time. The days that followed moved with a tense, watchful energy that settled over the entire castle like a held breath. Draven doubled the guard rotation, quietly, without announcing why, and Edric widened his investigation, following Cale's known movements over the past several months, searching for any pattern that might reveal who he had been meeting, and where. Lyra, still healing from her bruised ribs, found herself unable to simply rest and wait for answers to arrive on their own. She spent her recovering hours instead going through what little she could remember of pack politics from before Corin's death, trying to think through who among the ranking families might have reason to want the Ashgrave line weakened, who stood to gain from chaos within the castle walls, who had the patience and resources to plan something this careful. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, sitting with Edric in the war room going over old records of pack alliances, that she first noticed the name that would eventually crack the whole conspiracy open. House Renfrew, a smaller allied family that had lost significant standing within the Pack Council 2 generations earlier, after an ancestor of theirs had been passed over for the Ashgrave throne in favor of Draven's own bloodline. It was old history, the kind most people had long since forgotten mattered. But Lyra, reading through the faded records with fresh eyes, felt something click into place. Edric, she said slowly, who currently leads House Renfrew. Edric glanced up from his own stack of papers, considering the question. Lord Osric Renfrew. He sits on the council, though he rarely speaks during sessions. Quiet man, careful. Careful enough to wait 2 generations for a chance to settle an old grievance, Lyra said, feeling the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in a way that made her stomach tighten with a mixture of excitement and dread. They brought the theory to Draven that evening, and he listened with the same careful, considering focus he brought to every serious conversation, weighing the possibility against everything else they had learned so far. It's plausible, he admitted finally. Osric has never openly challenged my rule, but he has also never been particularly warm toward it. If he believed removing your bond, and destabilizing my reign in the process, could open a path back toward power for his family, it would explain the patience and the planning both. We need proof, Edric said. Suspicion alone won't hold against a ranking lord at council, especially one as careful as Osric has always been. Then we find proof, Draven said, starting at the Midwinter Council tomorrow. If Osric is behind this, he will be watching closely to see how the pack reacts to Lyra's continued survival, and to whether the Warden bond gains acceptance among the ranking families. That reaction, if we watch for it carefully, may tell us everything we need to know. The Midwinter Council convened the following afternoon in the castle's great hall, a room Lyra had only ever seen from a distance during pack gatherings before her life had turned upside down. Now she walked into it at Draven's side, her collar deliberately left loose enough to show the crescent mark beneath it, a decision Draven had made carefully, understanding that hiding the bond any longer would only feed suspicion rather than calm it. The ranking families gathered slowly, murmurs rippling through the hall the moment they caught sight of Lyra walking beside their king rather than kneeling in chains before him. Lord Osric Renfrew sat near the back of the assembled council, an older wolf with sharp, careful eyes that gave away nothing as he watched the pair approach the raised dais at the head of the hall. Draven addressed the council directly, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room. 6 days ago, this council believed a grave injustice had been served. I stand before you now to correct that belief. Lyra Ashwood did not kill her mate. She was falsely condemned for a crime committed by another, acting under orders we are still working to trace fully. The murmurs grew louder, and Draven raised a hand for silence before continuing. She carries the Warden mark, bound to my own, by blood older than this council's oldest laws. I ask that this court recognize that bond, and recognize her innocence, formally and without further delay. It was Lord Osric who rose first from among the gathered council, his expression carefully neutral, his voice smooth and measured in a way that immediately put Lyra on edge. My king, we do not doubt your conviction in this matter. But the Warden bond is an old and rarely invoked law. one this council has little modern precedent to properly evaluate. Might I suggest that before we recognize such a significant claim, formally, before the entire pack, we first require more concrete proof than a birthmark and your own testimony. It was a reasonable-sounding request on its surface, the kind of careful, procedural objection that would sound entirely appropriate to anyone unaware of the deeper conspiracy running beneath it. But Lyra, watching Osric's face closely as he spoke, caught the faintest flicker of something colder beneath his measured tone, a quiet satisfaction at having found a procedural wedge to slow down exactly the recognition Draven was trying to secure. "The mark manifested before this entire council 6 days ago," Draven said, his voice edged with a warning that few in the room likely missed. There were over 200 witnesses present. "Witnesses who saw a mark," Osric said smoothly, "but who lacked the expertise to confirm it as a genuine warden bond rather than, forgive me, a birthmark that merely resembles the old symbol closely enough to convince a king already inclined toward mercy." The insinuation landed exactly as Osric intended, a ripple of uncertain murmurs spreading through the assembled families, and Lyra felt her pulse quicken with something between anger and fear. This was precisely the challenge Draven had warned her about days earlier, the possibility that the court might attempt to disprove the bond's legitimacy entirely, and if they succeeded, the delayed execution sentence would stand exactly as it had before, mark or no mark. Draven's expression hardened, and for a moment Lyra thought he might simply overrule the objection with the full force of his crown, but instead he took a slow breath and addressed the council with careful precision. "Then this court will have its proof. I invite any elder scholar among you, or any outside expert this council trusts, to examine both marks directly and confirm their nature according to the old texts. I have nothing to hide in this matter, and neither does she." It was a bold offer, one that visibly caught Osric off guard, his careful composure slipping just slightly before he recovered it. "That seems reasonable, my king," he said, though something in his tone suggested he had expected Draven to simply demand acceptance rather than invite scrutiny. "Good," Draven said. "Then let it be done properly, and let this council finally put to rest any doubt about what happened here, and about what will happen to anyone who conspired to see an innocent woman executed for a crime she did not commit." The last part of that statement landed heavily across the hall, and Lyra, watching carefully, saw Osric's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack she had seen in his careful composure since the session began. It was not proof, not yet, but it was something, a small crack in a mask that had otherwise been worn flawlessly, and she understood, watching it, that Draven's willingness to invite scrutiny rather than avoid it had done exactly what they hoped it might. It had made whoever was behind this conspiracy nervous enough to show, even briefly, that they had something to hide. The council session continued for another hour, working through routine matters that felt almost absurd given everything happening beneath the surface, and Lyra spent every remaining minute watching Osric carefully, cataloging every small gesture, every careful glance he exchanged with other members of the assembled families, searching for any further crack in the composure he had otherwise maintained so completely. It was near the end of the session, as the council began preparing to disperse, that she caught it. A brief exchange of glances between Osric and a younger wolf seated near the hall's side entrance, a guard she recognized vaguely from the castle's regular rotation, someone she had passed in the corridors a dozen times without ever thinking twice about his presence. The glance lasted only a second, but it carried a weight that told her everything she needed to know. Whoever that guard was, he was reporting to Osric, and Osric, watching this entire council session unfold with such careful, practiced neutrality, was far more invested in its outcome than any ordinary lord objecting to procedural concerns had any reason to be. She caught Draven's eye across the hall and gave the smallest possible nod toward the side entrance. He understood immediately, his own gaze flicking briefly toward the young guard, before returning to the business of closing the council session, giving no outward sign that anything unusual had been noticed at all. "We have our next thread to pull," Lyra murmured to him quietly, once the hall had mostly emptied and only Edric remained close enough to hear. That guard by the side entrance. Osric was watching him as closely as he was watching us. "Then we find out exactly who he is," Draven said, "and exactly what he's been reporting back to Lord Renfrew, before Osric realizes his composure slipped today, and decides it's time to accelerate whatever comes next." Edric identified the young guard within a day. His name was Bram, a wolf who had joined the castle guard only 8 months earlier, carrying letters of recommendation that, upon closer inspection, traced back to a minor estate quietly connected to House Renfrew, through a marriage 2 generations old, obscure enough that nobody reviewing his application at the time had thought to look any further. It was a patient kind of infiltration, the sort that took years of planning rather than weeks, and it told Lyra and Draven both exactly how long Osric Renfrew had been preparing for whatever this conspiracy was ultimately meant to accomplish. Bram was watched rather than confronted, at Draven's careful instruction, in the hope that his movements might lead them toward Cale's current hiding place, or toward whatever plans Osric had set in motion following the council session's uncomfortable turn. For 2 days, nothing unusual occurred. Bram performed his regular duties, exchanged no obvious further contact with Osric, and gave no outward sign that he suspected he was being watched at all. It was during those same 2 days that word began spreading through the ranking families about the challenge Draven had issued at council, and to Lyra's surprise, rather than uniting the court behind Osric's careful skepticism, the offer to have the bond examined properly seemed to shift opinion gradually in her favor. Several of the older families, it turned out, remembered enough of the old law to be genuinely curious about seeing a true warden bond confirmed in their lifetime, an event rare enough that its authenticity, once proven, would carry enormous weight regardless of anyone's personal feelings about the woman who happened to carry it. An elder scholar named Perrin, one of the few remaining wolves in the pack who had studied the old texts extensively, arrived at the castle 3 days after the council session to examine both marks properly. He was an unassuming man, small and stooped with age, but his eyes were sharp and his manner brisk, entirely uninterested in the political tensions swirling around his examination, and focused instead purely on the scholarly question in front of him. He examined Lyra's mark first, in the privacy of the war room, turning her collar gently aside with careful, practiced hands, and studying the crescent shape for a long moment, before nodding slowly to himself. Then he examined Draven's matching mark beneath his ribs, comparing the two carefully, measuring the break in each curve against something in an old text he had brought with him. They match, Perrin said finally, closing his book. Not merely similar, identical in every measurable way the old texts describe. This is a genuine warden bond, my king. I would stake my scholarly reputation on it without hesitation. The relief that moved through Lyra at those words was almost overwhelming, a tightness in her chest she had not fully realized she was carrying, until it finally, partially, released. It was not everything. Osric's underlying conspiracy remained unproven, Cale remained unfound, and the deeper danger threatening both her and Draven remained very much alive. But this, at least, was solid ground beneath her feet for the first time since the fire had taken everything else away. Thank you, Draven said to the old scholar, genuine gratitude evident in his voice. Will you present these findings to the full council? I will, Perrin said, though I suspect, given how quickly word travels through this castle, most of the ranking families already know what I'm about to confirm, before I ever say a word. He was right. By the time the news reached the full council formally 2 days later, it had already spread through every corridor and kitchen in the castle, and the reaction, when Perrin stood before the assembled families and confirmed the bond's authenticity, was less shock than quiet, widespread acknowledgement of something everyone had already half suspected. Lyra watched Osric carefully throughout the announcement, and saw for the second time a crack in his composure, brief but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of plans now moving faster than he had originally intended. It was that same evening, hours after the council session ended, that Bram finally made his move, slipping away from his regular guard duties under cover of darkness, and heading not toward the castle's exits, as Draven's watchers had expected, but deeper into the castle itself, toward the private chambers reserved for visiting nobility, chambers currently occupied by Lord Osric Renfrew himself. Edric, following at a careful distance, listened outside the door long enough to catch fragments of a conversation that confirmed everything they had suspected and more. Osric's voice, usually so carefully measured, had lost some of its composure entirely, sharp and urgent in a way that carried clearly through the door despite his efforts to keep his voice low. The bond is confirmed, Osric was saying, publicly, before the full council. We no longer have the luxury of patience. If she survives long enough to bear an heir with that mark, the Ashgrave line becomes untouchable for another generation, and everything we've worked toward becomes worthless. Cale is still in hiding, Bram's voice replied, quieter, more hesitant. He won't risk coming back into the castle after the training yard fight went wrong. Then we don't need Cale, Osric said. We need someone already inside these walls, someone with access no one would think to question. You've served this castle for 8 months without a single mark against your name. Nobody will suspect you of anything until it's already finished. Edric had heard enough. He retreated quietly, careful not to alert either man to his presence, and made his way immediately to find Draven, who was still awake in the war room, going over old records with Lyra, both of them searching for any further connection between House Renfrew and the fabricated border dispute that had drawn Draven away on the night of the storeroom fire. Osric just gave Bram an order, Edric said, breathless from moving quickly through the castle's dark corridors. He intends to finish what Kale failed to do, tonight, or very soon. He believes Bram's position inside the castle gives him access no one would think to question. Draven was on his feet instantly, his expression hardening into the focused, dangerous calm of a king, facing a threat he finally had the clarity to properly address. Where is Bram now? Returning to his regular post, likely to avoid suspicion, Edric said, but Osric's words were clear. He intends to act soon, tonight possibly, while the castle is still absorbing the news of the bond's confirmation, and everyone's guard is lowered by the relief of it. Lyra felt her pulse quicken, not with fear this time, but with a sharp, focused readiness she recognized from the training yard fight with Kale days earlier. Then we don't wait for him to come to us, she said. We prepare properly this time, and we make sure that whatever Bram attempts tonight becomes the proof this council needs to finally act against Osric directly. Draven looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and protective moving behind his eyes. This is dangerous. If Osric is desperate enough to move now, he may not care about subtlety any longer. I know, Lyra said, but I've already survived a fire, an execution, and a fight with a trained guard in the dark. I'm not interested in simply waiting quietly in a locked room while everyone else decides my safety for me. Let me help end this properly, tonight, before Osric has the chance to try again a third time. Draven held her gaze a long moment, weighing the fierce determination in her expression against every protective instinct that had grown steadily stronger in him since the moment her collar first slipped on the execution grounds. Finally, he nodded, slow and reluctant, but genuine. Then we prepare together. Edric, double the watch on Bram immediately, quietly, without alerting him that we already know his purpose. Whatever happens tonight, I intend for it to be the last mistake House Renfrew ever makes against this crown. The castle settled into an uneasy quiet as night deepened, most of its residents unaware of the careful trap being set within its walls. Draven positioned guards at strategic points throughout the corridors leading toward Lyra's chambers, while keeping their numbers subtle enough not to alert Bram that his intended path had already been anticipated. Lyra herself refused to simply wait behind a locked door as bait, insisting instead on remaining close enough to Draven's side that whatever confrontation came, she would be present for it, rather than sheltered from it. They did not have to wait long. Just past midnight, Fennec, stationed quietly near the servants' passage that connected the guard barracks to the residential wing, signaled that Bram had left his post and was moving through the castle with the careful, unhurried pace of a man trying very hard not to look like he was doing anything unusual. Draven and Lyra followed at a careful distance, trailed by Edric and 2 additional guards, watching Bram's path wind through corridors that led, unmistakably, toward the east wing where Lyra's chambers were located. He paused outside her door for a long moment, glancing both directions down the empty hallway, and then produced a key that no ordinary guard should have possessed, sliding it into the lock with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly prepared this exact moment carefully in advance. Now, Draven said quietly, and the guards moved. Bram spun at the sound of approaching footsteps, and whatever calm composure he had carried through the corridors vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, cornered look of a man realizing his careful plan had failed before it ever truly began. He reached for the blade at his belt, but Fennec was faster, closing the distance and pinning his arm before the weapon ever cleared its sheath. "It's over," Draven said, stepping into the light, Lyra close beside him. "Lord Osric's orders. We heard everything." Bram's face went pale, understanding immediately how thoroughly his plan had unraveled, and for a moment, he said nothing at all, simply staring at the small group now surrounding him with the particular blankness of a man calculating whether any version of the next few minutes ended well for him. "I was only following orders," he said finally, echoing the same defense Kale had offered days earlier in the dark training yard. "Then you'll have the chance to explain those orders in full, before the entire council," Draven said, his voice cold and final, "starting with exactly what Lord Osric Renfrew has been planning, and how long he's been planning it." Bram did not resist as the guards led him away. His earlier composure entirely collapsed into the quiet, resigned silence of a man who understood that whatever leverage he once believed he held had evaporated the moment his blade never had the chance to leave its sheath. Osric Renfrew was arrested within the hour, guards arriving at his chambers to find him already half-packed, a small travel bag sitting open on his bed as though some instinct had warned him, too late, that his careful years of patient planning were finally unraveling all at once. He did not resist either, though his composure, when Draven confronted him directly in the corridor outside his own chambers, remained far steadier than Bram's had been. "You'll find no written evidence," Osric said calmly, as guards secured his wrists. "Everything was arranged verbally, carefully, over years. Whatever Bram or Kale claim under questioning will be dismissed easily enough, as the desperate accusations of men trying to save themselves." "Perhaps," Draven said. "But you underestimated something, Osric. You underestimated how much a court that finally sees the truth, laid out plainly before them, is willing to believe, once given the chance to look at it honestly instead of accepting the easiest available story." Osric's composure flickered, just slightly, at that, and Lyra, watching from a few steps behind Draven, felt something settle in her chest that was not quite triumph, but held pieces of it. The particular satisfaction of watching a man who had spent years believing himself untouchable finally understand that his careful patience had not been enough after all. The following days brought a flurry of activity through the castle as the full scope of Osric's conspiracy slowly came to light. Kale, it turned out, had not gone far after fleeing the training yard fight, and was located within the week hiding in a small cabin on the outskirts of Renfrew territory, apparently under the mistaken belief that his former patron would continue protecting him even after his failure. He was brought back to the castle in chains, and under careful questioning, confirmed everything Lyra and Draven had already begun to suspect. Osric had approached him nearly a year earlier, long before Corin's death, recognizing in Kale a wolf, ambitious enough and discreet enough to carry out a plan built on old grudges and older law. The full council convened a week later to hear the complete case laid out before them, evidence gathered carefully by Edric over the preceding days, woven together into an account too thorough and too consistent to dismiss as anything other than the truth. Kale's confession, Bram's corroborating testimony, the silver thread found at the fire site, the fabricated border dispute that had drawn Draven away on the exact night of the storeroom fire. Piece by piece, the conspiracy that had cost Corin his life, and nearly cost Lyra hers as well, was laid bare before every ranking family in the pack. Osric did not deny it, in the end, once the weight of evidence made denial pointless. He stood before the full council with the same careful composure he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, and when Draven finally asked him directly why he had done it, his answer was almost disappointingly simple. "2 generations ago, my family should have held this throne," Osric said. "History decided otherwise, and I have spent my entire life watching my family's standing diminish, year after year, while the Ashgrave line grew stronger and more secure. I saw an opportunity to correct an old injustice, and I took it. I regret that Corin Vale died in the process. I do not regret trying." It was not remorse, not really, but it was honesty, and Lyra, standing beside Draven as the council delivered its judgment, found she did not need Osric's remorse nearly as much as she needed the truth finally spoken plainly, in front of everyone who had once been so quick to condemn her without asking a single real question. The council's judgment came swiftly. Osric Renfrew was stripped of his title and his family standing within the pack, exiled beyond the northern border, with the clear understanding that any attempt to return would be met with the same severity the old execution law had once, wrongly, reserved for Lyra herself. Kale and Bram faced their own judgment separately, their sentences severe but, Lyra noted with some quiet satisfaction, arrived at only after a full and proper hearing, the exact kind of careful justice that had been denied to her entirely just 2 weeks earlier. As the council session finally drew to a close, and the ranking families began filing out of the great hall, murmuring quietly among themselves about everything they had just witnessed, Draven turned to Lyra with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something that looked almost like relief allowed to fully surface for the first time since the whole ordeal began. "It's finished," he said quietly. "Not quite everything," Lyra said, "but the part that mattered most, yes. Corin's killer has been named, properly, before the whole pack. Whoever ordered it has answered for that choice. That's more than I ever believed I'd get, kneeling in that snow 2 weeks ago." Draven was quiet for a moment, studying her carefully in the fading light of the emptying hall. "What happens now, for you? Justice has been served. The bond has been confirmed. You're no longer bound to this castle by anything, except the mark neither of us chose." Lyra considered the question seriously, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle differently now that the immediate danger had finally passed. She thought of the small house that no longer existed, the garden that would not bloom again this spring, the life she had built with Corin that fire and betrayal had taken from her so completely. She thought, too, of the strange, unexpected warmth that had grown quietly throughout these 2 weeks, sitting alongside her grief rather than replacing it, present in every late-night conversation by a low fire, every moment Draven had chosen to believe her when believing her cost him something. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I know I don't want to simply walk away from whatever this is, between us, before we've had the chance to understand what it actually means, beyond the mark, and beyond the danger that's finally over." Draven's expression softened at that, something quietly hopeful moving behind his eyes, that she had not seen from him since this whole ordeal began. "Then perhaps," he said, "we take the time now that we were never given before, to understand it properly, together, without a blade or a conspiracy hanging over either of our heads." It was not a resolution, not yet, not the kind of neat and tidy ending that closed every open question in a single conversation. But it was a beginning, honest and uncertain in the way real beginnings often are, and as they walked together out of the great hall and into the cold, clear evening air, Lyra felt, for the first time since the fire had taken everything from her, that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. Spring came slowly to the Packlands that year, the snow melting in careful stages rather than all at once, as though the season itself understood how much had been broken over the winter, and wanted to give everything time to heal properly before asking it to bloom again. Lyra walked the grounds where her old house had once stood, on a clear morning when the frost had finally lifted enough to let new grass push up through the blackened earth, and found herself, for the first time in months, able to stand there without her chest tightening painfully around the memory. She had not forgotten Corin. She understood now that she never fully would, and had stopped expecting herself to. Grief, she had learned over these long months, did not disappear simply because justice had finally been served. It changed shape instead, softening at its sharpest edges, settling into something she could carry alongside the rest of her life, rather than something that threatened to swallow every other feeling whole. She visited the burned foundation often, in these early spring mornings, and spoke to him quietly sometimes, telling him about the strange turns her life had taken since the fire, trusting that wherever he was now, he would understand, and perhaps even find some of it as darkly funny as he would have found it while still alive. The pack itself had changed too, in the months since Osric's exile. The council, forced to reckon publicly with how easily an innocent woman had nearly been executed on the strength of assumption rather than evidence, had quietly begun reforming the old execution laws, adding requirements for proper investigation that had never existed before. Lyra had been consulted on those reforms more than once, her own experience serving as the clearest possible argument for why such changes mattered, and she found a quiet satisfaction in knowing that whatever had been taken from her, something lasting and useful had grown from the wreckage of it. Draven had changed as well, in ways that were harder to name but easy enough to notice for anyone who had known him before the fire. He listened more carefully now, in council sessions, to voices that might once have been dismissed too quickly. He asked more questions before accepting easy answers, a habit Lyra liked to think she had some small part in teaching him, though he always insisted, whenever she suggested as much, that the lesson had cost him far too much to credit entirely to her influence. Their bond, the strange, unchosen thing that had first announced itself in a birthmark neither of them had understood, had grown into something neither old law nor ancient texts had fully prepared either of them for. It was not the sweeping, instant devotion the old stories sometimes described. It had grown slowly instead, built across quiet conversations by a low fire, across shared danger in a dark training yard, across the particular trust that forms between two people who have watched each other choose honesty even when an easier lie was available. Lyra found, walking the grounds of her old home on that clear spring morning, that she did not need the bond to explain what she felt for Draven anymore. She simply felt it, plainly and steadily, the way Corin had once loved her, without needing every piece of it to be complicated. She found Draven waiting for her near the edge of the property when she finally turned to walk back toward the castle, his expression carrying the particular patience of a man who had learned, over these past months, exactly how much space her grief still occasionally needed, and exactly when to simply be present without asking anything more of her than that. "How was he today?" Draven asked quietly, falling into step beside her as they walked back together. "Good," Lyra said. "I told him about the council reforms. I think he would have laughed at how seriously everyone takes proper investigation now, considering how little anyone bothered with it when it actually mattered." Draven's mouth curved into something gentle. "He sounds like he would have been difficult to keep up with." "He was," Lyra agreed, "in all the best ways." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the spring air carrying the particular sharp, clean smell of thawing earth, new growth pushing up everywhere the snow had finally retreated. Lyra thought of the birthmark still resting quietly beneath her collarbone, the mark that had once nearly failed to appear in time, the mark that had, against every expectation either of them once carried, become the beginning of something neither grief nor old law had fully prepared her for. "I've been thinking," Draven said finally, as the castle came back into view ahead of them, its gray stone catching the pale spring light in a way that looked, for the first time since Lyra had arrived there in chains, almost welcoming. "About what comes next, for us, not the bond, not the crown. Simply us, whatever that turns out to mean, once we've both had the chance to decide it for ourselves rather than having old law decide it for us." "And what have you decided?" Lyra asked, glancing sideways at him with the careful curiosity of someone who had learned, over these past months, to trust his honesty even when it was not the easiest thing to hear. "I've decided," Draven said, "that I'd like to find out together, slowly, without a conspiracy or an execution forcing our hand. I'd like to simply know you, Lyra, beyond the mark, beyond everything that brought us to this point, if you're willing." Lyra considered the offer seriously, feeling the full weight of everything the past months had cost her, and everything they had also, unexpectedly, given her in return. She thought of the woman who had knelt in the snow believing her life was already over, and the woman walking beside Draven now, scarred but steady, grieving but no longer alone, standing at the edge of a future that felt, for the first time in a very long while, genuinely worth walking toward. "I'm willing," she said simply, and found, saying it, that she meant it completely. They reached the castle gates as the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning frost, and walked through them together, not as king and prisoner, not as captor and condemned, but as two people bound by something older than either of their individual histories, choosing, deliberately and honestly, to build something new out of everything the fire and the conspiracy had tried, and failed, to destroy. Behind them, the blackened foundation of Lyra's old home sat quiet under the thin spring sunlight, new grass already beginning to soften its harshest edges, patient proof that even after the worst kind of loss, something could still, eventually, find a way to grow again.